Welcome to CEC's Division for Learning Disabilities video series, PD in 3. This series is designed for teachers, teacher leaders, and higher education faculty who work directly with or support educators work with students with or at risk for learning disabilities. In this video, you'll meet a prominent researcher and learn how to incorporate research-based practices into your classroom or into trainings for teachers. Our guest researcher will highlight one of their studies and provide major takeaways from the study that are applicable to educators of students with learning disabilities. Thank you and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to DLD's video series PD in 3. I'm Kelly Williams, an assistant professor of special education at Indiana University and a DLD member. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. John Hoover. Dr. Hoover is an associate professor of research at the University of Colorado Boulder. Welcome, Dr. Hoover, and thank you for taking the time to share your award-winning work with educators of students with learning disabilities.
Very happy to be here.
We wanted to start by having you take a moment to introduce yourself, tell us your name, any research interests you have, so we can get to know you a little better before we start talking about your study.
As you indicated, I'm John Hoover. I am associate professor of research at the University of Colorado here in Boulder, and I've been here since 1998. And my research focuses on diversity and exceptionality, emphasizing best practices for delivering culturally and linguistically responsive instruction, which I will refer to as CLR instruction as we go through this session. Within this context, I've been examining critical features necessary to create CLR referrals, CLR assessment, and CLR IEPs. I am particularly interested in helping to shape educational policy to improve the education of diverse learners in special education, especially for English learners with learning disabilities.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that information. Let's start off by telling, if you could tell us a little bit more about the study that you're going to be sharing with us today and who your co-authors were on that study.
Sure. The purpose of the study was to examine IEPs of English learners for evidence of CLR content. The title of the project is Examining IEPs of English Learners with Learning Disabilities for Cultural and Linguistic Responsiveness. My co-authors are Jennifer Erickson, who is a special education teacher in a rural community school district in Colorado, Drs. James Patton and Lee Tran at the University of Texas at Austin, and Dr. Donna Sacco at the American Institutes for Research.
Wonderful. So if you could start by telling us about the purpose or goal of this study and why it's important or relevant to the field of learning disabilities.
Sure. So again, the purpose of the study was to examine IEPs of English learners to determine to what extent CLR material and content is embedded into the IEP to help make the special education culture and linguistically responsive, similar to what we expect in general education. This study is highly relevant to students with learning disabilities and their teachers for a couple of reasons. First, many ELs are placed in special education for learning disabilities, often in the area of reading. And second, IDEA mandates that for English learners, IEPs need to consider the language needs of students relative to IEP goals.
Okay, that's great. That's a really important issue. And I know that we definitely have an increasing number of students who are identified as English learners and also identified with learning disabilities throughout the country.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the IEP analysis that you did in the study and any information you learned that's essential for teachers or leaders to understand as they attempt to develop culturally and linguistically responsive IEPs.
Sure. So the implementation of our study included completion of 3 interrelated tasks. First, we identified the IDEA mandated IEP components that provide the best opportunities to incorporate CLR material into the IEP. We identified present level statements, the annual goals, special factors, and accommodations as the 4 places within an IEP that CLR content could be best incorporated. Second, we selected several core research-based instructional features that best reflect CLR instruction that all teachers who teach diverse learners should be using on a regular daily basis. We identified 5 of these. First, English language development opportunities. Second, learner use of both first and second languages. Third, ESL bilingual best practices. Fourth, conditions under which the student best learns. And fifth, the accommodations that might reflect cultural and linguistic qualities. Based on these first 2 tasks, we then developed what we refer to as the IEP analysis tool to document evidence of the CLR features addressed within the 4 mandated IEP components. Using this analysis tool, we review the IEPs documenting any evidence of 1 or more of the 5 CLR instructional features. 2 researchers scored each of the IEPs, and a third researcher scored a random selection of some of the IEPs to confirm scorer reliability, which was about 100% or near 100%. In terms of information learned, I think one of the more important lessons learned is that for ELs, it is essential to focus on best practices specific to culture and language, going beyond the IEP features that we generally see as generic statements that we find in the IEPs. So for example, rather than stating provide paired learning, rephrase this to read provide paired learning with a first language peer, or state annual goals to include both content and language development rather than just content. So you could say something like provide or increase reading comprehension while building background knowledge. These types of statements guide the implementation of IEPs in a more CLR way.
Great. Thank you for those examples. Those were really helpful to kind of see what you're talking about when you refer to, adjusting accommodations, services, present levels, that kind of information.
And the statements are very simple to add. It's not like it takes a lot of extra time to do this. It's a mindset that we as teachers really need to think about as we develop IEPs, where we apply CLR principles and best practices within the special education.
Right, and I think that's really important. And from what I understand from your study and your analysis of these IEPs is that was really missing from a lot of the IEPs that you analyzed, correct?
Correct, yes. So our research, we had several findings, but 3 of them. First is reference to academic English language development to meet IEP goals was not found. Second, none of the accommodations referenced culture or linguistic qualities. And third, overall, the IEPs did not include CLR features in any of the 4 IEP components. So as you indicated, unfortunately, we did not find much in terms of CLR. One of the things that we also did within the study is we crossed out the name of the student and we looked at the IEP and any background information that may have been included. And then we reviewed the IEP to see if someone else could determine if it was an English learner or not. And in most cases, they could not. So it was more like an IEP for anyone that we have in special ed without specific reference to CLR content, which is important, obviously, for diverse learners.
Right, and I think that's an extremely important point that you make there about that those language supports and cultural supports were not really mentioned. The fact that you could read an IEP and not know if it was a student who was an English learner or not, it's kind of striking to me when we think about how important culture and language are with respect to students learning and using that to help it improve their learning outcomes.
Yes, and again, just going back to the fact that in general education, before we refer an English learner, we would want to see that CLR instruction was provided. For some reason, when they get to special education, we don't see the same need. And that's
right, and that's despite the mandates, right, that you referred to earlier.
Yes, yes.
So when we think about, I think you kind of mentioned kind of major takeaways or implications, but I'm kind of wondering how difficult is it, you kind of alluded to this earlier, but how difficult is it really to create these CLR IEPs? What kind of things do educators need to be thinking about, or do they need special professional development or training? If you could elaborate on that, I think that would help teachers out there understand this a little
Sure.
bit better.
So background in English as a second language and working with diverse populations is always going to be very important. I don't know how much in-depth professional development a person would need. If a teacher writing an IEP took the 5 features that we identified, English language development opportunities, to say as an example for the first one, and just thought about when they generate the present level statements, they talk about what those development opportunities are and have been for the student and how they might be successful for a future teacher to use. Or building in ESL best practices such as building background knowledge along with increasing reading comprehension. It's not difficult to do this, and oftentimes what we see, the best way to do this would be to write this from the ground up, but oftentimes we're modifying an existing IEP or existing statements where we have to embed CLR material. And so it's really about just understanding what some of the basic types of best practices are that we should be doing with CLD learners all the time, and just embed those in the present level statements, in the annual goals. If there are any special factors of using a language peer or whatever, or accommodations of using first language materials, it's very easy to add these things in. It's just a matter of having the mindset to think about that, which is where I really see the biggest problem. I'd like
I
to
think that, oh, go ahead.
I'd like to share a couple of implications and then speak a little bit about the concern that we found and that we have with moving from general ed to special ed with CLD students. So, and I think this would help inform teachers in writing their IEPs. So first, culture and language require increased attention in IEPs for ELs. So when you write them, think about how you're embedding statements about valuing culture and developing language within the IEP. IEP should document somehow how second language acquisition fits into special education. How does it work with special education as opposed to this silo kind of thing that we have where it's someone else's concern for English language development and it's my concern as a special educator to only do special education. What we're trying to promote is that both need to be incorporated into the IEP and addressed in the IEP. And the third then kind of builds from those two is that IEP developers need to understand that academic goals and language proficiency are interconnected. You can't have or won't have as much progress towards academic goals if you don't have progress towards English language proficiency. So the two work together. And if they're embedded in the IEP in such a way that the teacher is cognizant of building background knowledge and accessing prior knowledge and building vocabulary, you in turn will be helping the student meet the content objectives and goals of the IEP.
Right. I think that's really important to note about the academic language. And we know that academic language affects students' performance, whether it's in mathematics, whether it's in reading language arts. And those, a lot of times are overlooked for all students, but particularly for students who are learning a second language as well. One of the other things that I think really stood out to me in your article and that I wanted to point out that you just touched upon was that collaboration among special education teachers, general education teachers, and English language service providers. And I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit more about, how that might be applied in the IEP. Is that a service maybe that, scheduling time for collaboration or that could be even potentially written into students' IEP services and support?
Yes. The collaboration among the general education, special education, and ELD specialists is critical in developing an IEP for ELs or other diverse students. Without that, one of the 3 or 4 topics that we need to include would be not included. So yes, you need to find the time Unfortunately, in many places, the special educator just kind of generates the IEP. And if that's the case, then just make sure that you consult with and collaborate with general education as well as the ELD specialist. And in particular, speak with the general educator about under what conditions the student best learns. What would you recommend to another teacher that he or she do with this student once special ed begins? And certainly with the ELD specialist, how language development could be embedded into, in a natural way, the development of progress towards the IEP goals. So yes, collaboration is critical with this, since no one person is going to have all the answers.
Yeah, great. That's some really great information. Do you have any additional comments that you would like to add about your study or the work that you've been doing?
Sure. Let me conclude with the idea that culture and language do not cease to become important in EL's instruction once special education begins. And then IEP developers must continue to get better at recognizing that, similar to general education, culture and language shape the delivery of appropriate special education for ELs, which should be clarified to some extent in the IEP, based both on the reality that many ELs are placed in special ed for learning disability, particularly in reading, but also, as we have discussed, the IEP mandate that says we have to consider language along with the IEP goals.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. So thank you so much for sharing your work with us today, Dr. Hoover. I'm really excited that educators had the opportunity to meet you and hear about how your work supports the important work they're doing in the classroom every day. And teachers, thank you for your time today. Please be sure to watch the other videos in our Council for Exceptional Children's Division for Learning Disabilities video series, PD in 3.
Thank you for joining us. To view resources associated with the research discussed in this video, or to watch other videos in the Division for Learning Disabilities video series PD in 3, please visit our website at www.teachingld.org.